The man at the door didn't flinch when he said it. "Sorry, sir, your name's not on the list." Frank Delaney stood frozen, gripping the hand-carved wooden bench he'd spent 3 months building. A wedding gift for his only daughter, the same daughter whose college tuition he paid, whose scraped knees he patched up, whose first apartment he furnished with his bare hands. And yet, not on the list. Behind that gate was a backyard he helped build with his own 2 hands, now transformed into a picture-perfect wedding venue. Laughter echoed over the fence. Champagne flutes clinked. Strangers walked past him in tailored suits and glossy heels, nodding politely, unaware of the weight in his chest. Frank blinked hard, steadying himself. It wasn't the rejection that hurt most. It was the silence. The message was clear. They wanted a wedding that looked good in pictures, and a retired carpenter didn't fit the aesthetic. Frank Delaney wasn't always invisible. At one point, he was the whole damn scaffolding that held his family up. After his wife walked out 17 years ago, no note, no goodbye, just a cold coffee mug on the counter, Frank rolled up his sleeves and raised 2 kids on his own. He turned down job promotions so he could be home for school pickups, packed lunches with handwritten notes, and stayed up late learning algebra just to help with homework. When Emily, his daughter, said she wanted to be a lawyer, Frank sold the last 5 acres of his family's land to pay for her tuition. Not a loan, a gift. No strings. That was how he loved, with action. He worked nights sanding reclaimed barnwood into furniture, just to cover rent and books. When his younger brother fell ill, Frank didn't think twice. He moved him in, built a ramp for his wheelchair, changed his IVs, bathed him. He never complained, never asked for recognition, because for men like Frank, you did what needed doing. No fanfare, no applause, just quiet grit. Holidays came and went with Emily promising she'd visit soon from law school, and Frank always smiled, said he understood. He did. People drift. Life moves. But somewhere along the way, those sacrifices turned into a fading photograph. People admired the picture, but no one asked about the man behind the camera. Now here he was, not even worthy of an RSVP. The very people he poured his life into had moved on, repackaged their memories to fit a cleaner narrative, one where Frank was absent, maybe even difficult. He wasn't polished like Emily's fiancé's father, a financial advisor with perfect hair and a voice like NPR. No, Frank had calloused hands, a busted knee from years on construction sites, and a voice that didn't sugarcoat. But he was real, and for too long being real had meant being forgotten. Frank didn't want to believe it, so he called her. Not Emily, because she hadn't answered a single message since the invitation got lost in the mail. He called Marla, his ex-wife, the woman who'd walked away from the family 2 decades earlier and somehow still managed to keep her grip on everything that mattered. Her voice came through smooth as ever, polished, practiced. "Frank, don't make this a thing. It was just easier this way." He held the phone tighter. "Easier how?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Emily wanted a certain atmosphere," Marla said, a sharp edge in her tone, "and let's be honest, you don't exactly fit in with that crowd." There it was, the cut. The kind that doesn't bleed on the outside but slices through the gut. "So it was your call," he said, voice low, not even hers. Marla hesitated just long enough to confirm everything. "She trusts me to handle these things. It's not personal." But that's exactly what it was. Personal. The erasure had been deliberate, and worse, it had been easy for them. They hadn't struggled with it. They hadn't even warned him. No call, no explanation, just a name taken off a list and a memory shoved in a drawer. Frank stood there, alone in his driveway, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the woman who once promised to grow old with him justify why he wasn't good enough to attend his own daughter's wedding. "You should be proud," she said. "Look at the life we gave her." We. That was rich. Marla had spent the last 15 years polishing her image, networking with the right people, dining at the right places, Meanwhile, Frank had been packing school lunches, mending scraped knees, and hauling lumber to pay for the life Marla now claimed as hers. And in the end, she'd edited him out of the story. Clean, swift, surgical. Like he was the embarrassing footnote to someone else's legacy. Frank looked down at the bench in the back of his truck. Simple, sturdy, made from reclaimed oak beams salvaged from an old barn he and Emily once visited when she was 10. He'd carved it with care, sanding every edge until it was smooth as glass. On the backrest, burned into the wood, were the words Emily once whispered after a nightmare. Always Daddy's girl. He remembered her clinging to him that night, her small hands wrapped around his neck, her breath warm on his shoulder. Now, those same words felt like a cruel echo. Still, he had brought the bench, loaded it up before dawn that morning, tied it down with bungee cords like he was delivering something sacred. It wasn't a gift from a forgotten father. It was a message. A reminder. As the sun dipped behind the reception tent and laughter floated over the fence, Frank carried it up to the staff entrance. A young man in a waiter's vest opened the side gate, clearly confused. "Could you do me a favor?" Frank asked gently. "Make sure this gets to the bride." The waiter nodded, unsure, but took it seriously. Frank stepped back and gave one last look at the woodwork. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't expensive, but it was real, and in that moment it was all he had left to give. He didn't wait for thanks, didn't expect a smile. He just turned and walked away, leaving behind a piece of himself in the shadows of a celebration he was never meant to see. Frank sat behind the wheel of his old Ford, parked just beyond the reach of the valet lights, watching silhouettes move inside the tent he wasn't welcome in. Music floated through the breeze, light, airy, the kind of soundtrack you'd hear in a movie where everything ends happily. But not here, not tonight. He watched as Emily, radiant and white, laughed with someone he didn't recognize. Cameras flashed, champagne flutes sparkled, a man in a tailored suit, her new father-in-law, probably, clinked a glass for a toast. No one noticed the truck. No one saw the man inside it. Frank wasn't bitter. He was past that. What he felt now was emptiness, a deep, hollow silence that swallowed every ounce of energy he had left. For over 2 decades, he had carried the weight of being everything: mother, father, provider, protector, and now here he was, a ghost watching his own daughter get married like a stranger off the street. A part of him wanted to storm in, say something, make a scene, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He wouldn't be the punchline in their polished photo album. Instead, he gripped the steering wheel and stared at the glowing tent, whispering to no one, "You're welcome." Then he turned the key, the engine coughing to life like it shared his exhaustion. As he pulled away, headlights lit the curb where the bench now rested under the stars. Unnoticed, forgotten, but solid, just like him. Back home, Frank climbed the attic stairs with a heaviness in his chest that matched the dust on every step. The air was thick with insulation and forgotten things, but he knew exactly where to go. Behind an old steamer trunk, under a blue tarp, was a cedar box he hadn't opened in years. He brought it down gently, wiping it clean like it was something sacred. Inside were stacks of paper, folders labeled in his neat block handwriting: Emily, tuition, home sale, 2011, Marla, insurance letter, receipts, checks, letters, proof. He sifted through the records one by one, watching years of sacrifice resurface. A copy of the cashier's check for $42,000. 0 cents. The last of his savings sent directly to the law school when Emily's financial aid fell through. An old note card she'd scribbled in thanks. "Someday I'll pay you back, Dad." She never did. But the one paper that stopped his breath was a warranty deed from 2011. It detailed the sale of their marital land, a chunk of acreage Frank agreed to sell to help Marla stay afloat after the divorce. He'd signed it trusting her to handle the rest, but the follow-up deed, dated a month later, showed something else. Marla had flipped the property into a private trust, the Harwood Legacy Trust, naming herself as trustee and Emily as beneficiary. Frank's name was nowhere to be found. The land that now hosted the wedding, the one he'd carved fence posts into with his bare hands, had been stolen. Legally, surgically, quietly. And then there was the insurance letter, his father's life insurance policy. Frank had always assumed the payout went to the kids, split evenly. But tucked inside was a copy of the disbursement form, with his signature forged, redirecting it to Marla's personal account. The betrayal was deeper than a wedding snub. It was a calculated erasure. Frank sat back in his worn recliner, the cedar box open beside him, and whispered aloud, "They didn't just forget me. They buried me." But now he had the shovel, and he wasn't done digging. Frank picked up his phone and scrolled to a number he hadn't dialed in years. Mitch Calhoun, his old army buddy from back in '87. They'd built bridges in the desert and dug trenches through hell together. Mitch now ran a small private investigation outfit 2 towns over. Frank hit call, and after 2 rings came that familiar gravelly voice. "Well, I'll be damned, Frankie Delaney." Frank didn't waste time. "I've got a situation. Land fraud. Forged documents. A daughter's wedding I was erased from." Mitch was silent for a beat. "You need proof?" Frank nodded into the silence. "I've got most of it, but I need someone to verify signatures, pull property records, maybe dig into a trust fund I never knew existed." Mitch didn't hesitate. "Send me what you've got. I'll run it through my guy at the county recorder's office." "And Frank?" "Yeah. If they thought you were dead and buried, then hell, let's wake the dead." Frank allowed himself the smallest smile. Justice had always been slow, but it didn't forget how to walk. 2 days later, a manila envelope landed on Frank's doorstep, courtesy of Mitch. Inside was the evidence he needed to confirm what he already knew deep down. He'd been swindled. The deed transfer forged. Mitch's contact at the county office verified the signature on the land transfer wasn't Frank's. Close, but off just enough to catch the trained eye. The trust, Harwood Legacy Trust, had been created by Marla using shell paperwork, legally laundering the land into Emily's name without Frank's knowledge. But that wasn't even the worst part. Mitch had also uncovered a secondary life insurance payout tied to Frank's late father's estate. That money had been explicitly designated for Frank's children, not his ex-wife. And yet, 6 months after the funeral, Marla submitted altered forms, catching out the entire amount into her private account. It was all there. Bank statements, emails, and a notarized affidavit from a former financial advisor who confirmed Marla had bragged about handling it before the old man got wise. Frank sat at the kitchen table staring at the pile of evidence, heart pounding, not from grief, but clarity. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a calculated theft. And the wedding? That was just the final bow on years of quiet betrayal. He wasn't just cut from the guest list. He was cut out of his own legacy. But now he had teeth. Now he had proof. Frank picked up the file, flipped to the notarized signature page and muttered, "She thought this was buried. But I've built whole houses from nothing. I'll rebuild my name from rubble." He slid the folder into a briefcase and locked it. The trap was set. All he had to do now was spring it. Sunday brunch at the Oaks Club was where people like Marla Harwood polished their image. White tablecloths, clinking mimosas, and whispers wrapped in pearls. Frank hadn't stepped foot inside since the Christmas party of '03, back when his name still meant something around here. But this morning, he walked through the front doors like a man with a key to the vault. Marla was seated near the window, laughing politely with 3 women who looked like they had shares in Botox. She didn't see him at first, not until he pulled out the chair across from her and calmly sat down. Her smile froze. "Frank," she said, voice tight, "this is a private." He slid a folder across the table. "Not today, it isn't." She hesitated, then glanced inside the folder, her face drained with every turn of the page. Deed forgery, life insurance theft, signature analysis, even a notarized letter confirming she redirected the funds. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "Where I needed to." Frank leaned in, voice steady. "You've got 48 hours. Fix it. Legally. Or I take it public. Your daughter deserves to know the truth. So does every person at this country club who thinks you're someone to admire." She tried to recover, sipping her drink with trembling hands. "You wouldn't ruin her wedding memory over something like this?" He nodded once. You already did that." Around them, polite society carried on, but Marla's hands were shaking as she tucked the papers back into the folder. "You always were dramatic," she muttered. Frank stood, buttoned his coat. "No, Marla. I was quiet. That's different, but you taught me something over the years. When someone builds their kingdom on lies, all it takes is one match." He turned and walked out, leaving her pale, silent, and surrounded by the very image she had fought to protect. The club's doors closed behind him, but he didn't smile. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt done. The truth was no longer a secret, and now the countdown had begun. The call came just after sunset, while Frank was out in the shed, sanding down a new table leg. His phone buzzed on the workbench, and when he saw Emily's name, his chest tightened. He wiped the sawdust off his hands before answering. "Dad?" Her voice cracked like a dry branch. I saw the documents. Mom showed me." Frank didn't say anything. He let the silence do the work. "Is it true?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "You paid for law school, sold the land, and She trailed off, swallowed hard. "Why didn't you tell me?" Frank leaned on the bench, staring at the grain of the wood. "Would you have believed me?" he asked, calm but tired. On the other end, Emily didn't answer right away. "I didn't know, Dad. I swear. I didn't know what she did." Frank's jaw clenched. "Truth was always there. You just didn't want to look." The line stayed quiet for a long while. Then came a soft, almost childlike, "I'm sorry." He nodded to no one in particular. "Sorry, don't fix it, Em, but it's a start." He hung up. No rage. No guilt. Just the heavy sound of a man finally being heard. By Wednesday morning, Frank's truth wasn't just buried in a manila folder anymore. It was headline news. The local paper ran the story under "Former Carpenter Exposes Real Estate Fraud in Family Land Dispute." His name was finally back in the public square, not as a troublemaker or a bitter ex, but as a man who refused to be erased. The documents Mitch helped compile were shared with both the county assessor's office and the local news outlet, and it didn't take long for the story to catch fire. Within hours, Marla's polished reputation began to crack. Clients started pulling listings from her agency. The board of the club she held dear called an emergency session. The whispers she once weaponized now turned against her. Even Emily released a quiet statement online, distancing herself from her mother's business affairs and admitting that the truth has been painful but necessary. Frank didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He sat on his porch, sipping black coffee while reporters knocked on the neighbors' doors, and his phone lit up with messages from people who used to nod politely but never really saw him. Now they did, and it wasn't fame he felt. It was validation, not revenge, resolution. Finally, the old garage behind Frank's house smelled like cedar and second chances. Where others saw a cluttered workshop, he saw the start of something real. With the money from a modest settlement and a few quiet donations from neighbors who'd read the story and wanted to help, Frank opened a small woodshop program, Delaney Craftworks, a place for at-risk boys and retired men alike. No lectures, no therapists, just sawdust, sweat, and purpose. Word got around fast. A quiet buzz in town about the old carpenter who turned betrayal into blueprints. Then one Saturday morning, Emily pulled up in a rental car. No press, no mother. Just her and the bench, the one Frank had built for her wedding. She carried it like a penance, like a daughter asking without words to be let back in. They didn't say much. She set it down near the shed and sat beside him, watching the light spill through the rafters. "You were always there," she finally whispered. "I see it now." Frank didn't respond right away. He just kept working the chisel in his hand, steady and slow. After a long moment, he nodded. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close, the kind of nod that said, "I'm still here, and that's enough. For now." Frank sat on the back porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the sycamores, the sky painted in soft oranges and forgiving blues. He didn't feel victorious. He felt settled. The kind of peace that doesn't come from winning, but from no longer needing to explain yourself. For years he'd labored in silence, believing that loyalty would be enough, that showing up day after day was what made a man worthy. But silence had a cost. It made it easier for people to rewrite your story in your absence. He'd thought about all the birthdays spent alone, the holidays where his chair at the table was quietly omitted, and still he had stayed kind. But kindness isn't weakness, it's endurance. The truth is, Frank never needed applause. He needed honesty. And when he realized he wasn't going to get it, he built his own justice from the scraps they left him, not to burn bridges, but to stop carrying ones he wasn't allowed to cross. Family, he now understood, isn't made from blood or shared last names. It's made from mutual respect and memory that honors, not edits. And legacy? It's not the size of your name in the obituary. It's what people remember when you're not in the room. You didn't need a speech or a standing ovation. Just the quiet rhythm of a chisel on wood, the echo of a daughter's apology, and the knowledge that when truth finally came knocking, he answered. And that was enough. This story reminds us that silence isn't always strength. It can be the doorway to erasure. Frank Delaney's journey shows what happens when a good man is pushed too far, not by strangers, but by the very people he sacrificed everything for. He gave, he built, he stayed, and they cut him out without hesitation. But instead of lashing out, he stood up, with truth, with proof, and with the quiet dignity that only a man who's lived through betrayal can carry. The real lesson? You can give everything and still be forgotten, unless you draw the line. Respect isn't something you earn just by being kind. It's something you demand by being unshakable in who you are. Frank didn't need revenge. He needed recognition. And when he got it, he didn't gloat. He got to work building something better. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of someone you know, don't scroll past. Like this video, hit that subscribe button for more real, powerful stories like this, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded. You don't have to be loud to be strong. You just have to stand your ground.